All right, it's 10 o'clock. I'll start getting moving with this. So as you all, I'm sure you're here for accessibility, you're going to talk about how we can get the whole team involved and just go over some of the basics of what it means to make an accessible website. To start off, my name is Michaela Blackham. I'm a front-end developer at Atten Design Group. Atten is a digital strategy, design, and development agency based out of Denver, Colorado. We use Drupal and other open source technologies, user-centered design, agile development methodologies, and a collaborative approach with our clients. We work with amazing organizations like Human Rights Watch, Stanford University, and the World Wildlife Fund, just to name a few. Most importantly, we love to work with cause-driven organizations that are focusing on doing work that actually matters, truly matters. And as you all know, we're here to talk about accessibility today. This track is really just a basic overview of what accessibility is, what it means, who it affects, and the various ways members of our teams can all get involved to actually accomplish this. But before we begin, I'd like to talk just a little bit about me. I started my career in the web industry originally as an interactive designer before I moved into development world full-time last year. And ever since I can remember, ease of use, interaction, great organization, and accessibility have always been very important to me. I grew up with a cousin my age with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and I was able to see how she was doing her homework, navigating the internet, or even just listen to music on her iPod, all with little to no mobility and difficulty speaking loud enough for talk-to-type programs like Dragon or Siri. Sometimes she had to get very creative, but most of the time she had to ask for help, which I know frustrated her immensely. And I always wanted to relieve her of that stress. So I started to get involved with accessibility slowly but surely, little bit by little bit, kind of how everybody else was in the past. But really, focusing on accessibility of your site is important in order to relieve the stress of everyone using your site, not just people who may struggle with it a bit more like M. So what is the problem? Why are we here today? Why are we talking about accessibility? Well, if you think about it, people are glued to their phones, their computers, tablets, as well as the wealth of knowledge and information we have at our fingertips. So if you wanted to go to a movie, how would you probably find out what time it was playing? Or if you were in a new city, like me, and wanted to go out to eat, how would you find somewhere that you actually want to eat at? Well, the internet, as we all know, is the main source of information for pretty much everyone nowadays. And according to the CDC, 53 million adults live with some form of a disability in the US. That's roughly about 22% of the population. So really, why does this affect you? Why are we, again, talking about accessibility? Because that's 1 in every 5 adults in the US. That's 1 in every 5 users that are coming to your site. And even more surprising is that this statistic doesn't actually include the number of internet and smartphone-obsessed children we have in this country, many of whom also qualify as disabled as well. So how do people who are blind or have low vision get the same information? What about people with a lack of mobility or of mouse control or touchscreen gestures? That question is why we're here and why there has been such a push for more accessible products. Let's include everyone in those cat videos and funny memes. No one wants to see someone as grumpy as this cat just because they can't easily access your site. So really, what is accessibility? Understanding what it is really the first step. And I know a lot of information out there can be kind of confusing. It's not worded in a way that's like necessarily human readable at some points. It's a little funky. So we're going to try and ease that confusion today and clear all of that up. And so accessibility is defined as being easy to obtain, use, and understand. But really, what does this mean? So we'll go into that today. And really, accessibility can be easily explained and achieved under the principle of POUR. Everything should be perceivable, operable, understandable, as well as robust. So every product that you're creating, users must be able to process that information. And this means providing text for those who cannot hear and audio for those who cannot see, as an example. This also means that your content must work with screen readers as well as other assistive technologies. When operable. Obviously, everyone should be able to operate your website and application, but you have to think about the variety of tools that they may be using to operate your site. Many users with disabilities cannot use a mouse. Alternatives like keyboard-based or touchscreen operations should always be implemented. And if you think about it, if users can perceive and operate a website, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can understand it. Understandable websites use clear, concise language and offer functionality that is easy to comprehend. Navigation should be used consistently across your site. Content and forms should guide a user through a logical flow and provide clear labels. If this feels like usability and not accessibility, that's because usable websites are inherently more accessible. And finally, robust. We want to make sure that our product works across all platforms, and that's including the fun, outdated IE versions, all the way back to IE6. And IE is actually a great program for screen readers to use. It's one of the most updated ones, surprisingly. It doesn't need to have all those fancy animations that we see a lot today, but the user should still be able to access the same information without any issues. So we have maybe a better understanding of what accessibility is and how we can achieve it, but we need to talk about who needs an accessible website. Any guesses to who needs a more accessible website? You don't actually have to answer if you don't want to, but okay. I know when I first started thinking about accessible websites, my mind immediately went to someone who needs to use a screen reader. And this is even with a family member struggling with a physical disability. But like others, when I heard web, I thought visual. When I first started out in the career, that's pretty much all I really thought involved. But after some time in the industry, my knowledge on who we needed to create an easier website for expanded. So who are we creating this for? Well, everyone benefits from an accessible website. There may be some demographics we tend to work a little bit harder to accommodate for, but in reality, creating a more accessible website creates a better experience for you as well as for me. But like many others, I fell into the usual groupings. Everyone tends to start off and think that accessible websites are just for the blind, but it can actually be broken down into 4 main categories. It can be visual impairments, motor or physical impairments, auditory impairments, as well as cognitive impairments. And because visual is the one we tend to talk about first, most often we'll talk about that first. But again, I bet when you heard visual, you immediately go to someone who's completely non-sighted, but there's really a lot more to it. So when we talk about visual impairments, what do we mean? Who does this actually involve? This could be someone with low, obstructed, or constricted vision. It could be my father, who's colorblind. And it could be each of our aging parents or grandparents. Now, when I first heard low or poor vision, I assumed blurry eyesight, and I'm sure some of you as well, or maybe losing one's sight completely, or something of that sort. But I didn't think of people who suffer from constricted vision or tunnel vision as an example. So if you guys want to do me a favor, if you hold your hand up and kind of make a little hole in your hand so it's like the size of the straw, if you look and go back and forth between the label and the input, this is kind of the experience that someone with tunnel and constricted vision is dealing with. They have to move their head back and forth, and relating those two elements is getting a little difficult. Even just with able eyes now, sometimes it's not just quite as easy of a line. Just by making something like this makes it that much easier for them. You have, even with that same tunnel vision, you still have that closer proximity, which makes the scanning a bit easier. And ideally, it should be something like this, where it has that logical flow. It kind of gives that more readable quality to it. Another way to think of constricted vision is something that's happened to me before, especially when responsive websites started coming out, has anyone ever maybe clicked on a link on their phone and it kind of zoomed in a little bit and nothing really happened? So you click it again and still nothing happens. So you keep clicking it, but really there's a little modal window or pop-up box that's happening off the screen that you just can't notice. That's kind of what they're dealing with all the time when they're clicking on something. They might not see what's happening, or if they have that kind of relation that's a little difficult to follow. So what types of things should you be looking for when you're thinking about visual impairments on your site? What types of questions should you be asking? You should ask, how does the user navigate the page when a mouse just is not an option? Or how does one get the information from an image or chart if they cannot see the image? How do you create an understanding of where the users are within the content without the help of visual cues? Is there enough contrast and color for the user to read and understand this content? Or is the typography choice easy to read at this font size? What about the line length? How about the line height? What about its color? As well as, does the user have to strain their eyes, similar to that example, or move their head back and forth, similar to the example I showed you with the hole in your hand example there? Those are some questions that you can ask yourself just to kind of put yourself in their position so you can actually make sure that everyone's having the best experience possible. Don't worry, this is currently being solved. We're going to go over a couple little things here that you guys can all look for. A lot of this can actually be solved with great architecture and great design. If you can't see where the cursor is, then why would you be using a mouse? Keyboard navigation enables the user to still explore your site easily. And sound enables the user to get the information they are looking for. How many people here have used a screen reader for personal or professional use? All right, so a couple of you. For me, I've only ever used it for professional use, for testing sites that I've kind of coded out. And I recently got to meet someone who uses this every day for everything that he does. He's a fourth-year senior at CU Boulder, and he is trying to become a software developer and website developer. He uses Drupal mostly, and he is completely non-sighted. He is contributing every day to NVDA, which is a screen reader for Windows. It's a great one. It's completely open source. But it was amazing to see how he uses a screen reader versus me, who is able, and just kind of the flow that he goes through and the things that I'm able to learn from him. I'm testing for certain things. He uses it to actually experience the site. So if you ever have the chance to meet someone who uses that every day, I definitely recommend it. It's going to be eye-opening and will help with your professional use as well. Next, we'll talk about motor or physical impairments. As you know, this is something that's very dear to me. It's what really got me thinking about accessibility to begin with. This is also something that we can very much relate to one another, because at some point we might have something that will interfere with using a site. So again, what does a motor or physical impairment mean? It could be someone like my cousin Emily who had a disability from birth. Or it could be the wounded vet that uses prosthetics and how the prosthetics actually works with the touch screens. Or even my niece with a broken arm or a finger. It's funny because when most people think of something physical interfering with using a computer or touchscreen device, a lot of people discount the users who are temporarily disabled. But this is something that can affect us at any time, whether it's an injured limb or finger, as we just mentioned, or aging bodies and just getting older and kind of losing some of that. So what types of things should you be looking for when it comes to motor or physical impairments? What types of things should you be asking yourself? You should ask, does your product require elaborate touch gestures or multiple finger interactions? What about quick double taps? Is the content easy to reach and interact with on this device? And how does one navigate and interact with a page where physical movement is difficult or non-existent? So this again is something that I mentioned that we can easily relate to. Does anyone remember when the large smartphones started coming out and people were getting frustrated that they couldn't necessarily reach something that was all the way on the top left or the top right, especially with the iPhones, the pluses? And then that's something that people that have that lack of mobility deal with every day. So what did we do? We figured out with a quick double tap on an iPhone anyway, it kind of brings the content further. But what about if you can't do that quick double tap? You now have that issue kind of going in both directions. I'm from New England, so I know the cold very well. I don't know how many people also encourage or love freezing weather, but have you ever stood at a bus stop or at a soccer game or a football game? You may have forgotten your gloves and you need to use your phone and you need to do that quick double tap, but your hands are so cold that you can't actually accomplish that. And there are people, like I mentioned, that just can't do that every day. So how is this currently being solved? Again, keyboard navigation is an absolute must, and for users who do not have that large range of motion. In a lot of instances, Emily was actually able to use touch screens because her fingers were able to move very well, but her whole arms weren't. And it was just a little easier for her to kind of still write those papers because she wanted that physical interaction. Could be the users, the use of programs like Dragon or Siri. And there are actually a lot of creative ways to solve this. So there's really so many out there, and obviously I just put some of the easier ones, but there's eye trackers where it will actually follow where your eyes are looking at on the screen more often, as well as tongue sensitivity clickers, which, to explain it as easily as possible, is kind of like a little trackpad, but for your tongue to actually use it, and it works very well. Or in my family's case, when Emily started, muscular dystrophy is a degenerative muscle disease, so it obviously got worse as she gets older. We got her a mind-reading device, but spoiler, it didn't work, but she looked pretty hilarious wearing it, and I searched everywhere for a photo of her wearing it. I could not find it for the life of me, so sorry. Next, we'll talk about auditory impairments. This is especially important in the educational world. As some of us might have seen with the accessibility scandal with UC Berkeley, did anyone hear about that in the past year? Well, they didn't account for people with auditory impairment for their free online material. So, as a result, the university had no option but to pull their entire collection of free educational material for the public. And obviously, that created a huge financial burden as well as some reputational consequences. We want to always try and avoid that, obviously. So when we talk about auditory impairments, again, what does this mean? Who does this involve? It could be someone who is completely non-hearing, or it could be my grandfather who wears a hearing aid. So what types of things should you be looking for or asking yourself when you're QAing a site or just creating a new site? We want to make sure a user can get all information from a video, or how can a user get all the information from a video without physically listening? And can a user contact your business in another way besides phone? Again, this is being solved currently. These are some things still to take a look at for based on auditory impairments. We want to make sure that we always provide descriptions about what is happening in a video embedded on the page, whether it's live captioning or downloading a transcript after the fact. And one you probably hear about a lot or alternative communication is, obviously we include email a lot of times, and even instant chats are starting to become a little more popular. Now, to kind of relate this to all of you, how many people have looked at Facebook during work or other instances where maybe you shouldn't be looking at Facebook or YouTube with the volume on? I know you guys have all done it, so there's no lying here. Well, think about it. You want to see that funny video that you're looking at. I'm going to keep bringing up cat and dog references, but I love it so much. But you want to kind of be a part of that, and if you don't have that closed captioning, then you're not going to be able to enjoy it. And think about the people that can't understand or can't work with that. If they can't hear it, you're going to miss out on those funny videos, and we all need a good laugh, always. Another good example is in school. Something that I was doing when I was in college especially was, instead of watching the videos, I would obviously watch it, don't tell my professors that, but I would also download the transcripts, and that was a great way to be able to highlight everything, because I mean, we're all there. If you're watching a video, not everyone pays attention to it the whole time. It's a 45-minute video, so being able to download those transcripts is even great for other users as well. And let's be real, kids right now don't really like to use the phone, or don't like to use the phone to call people. So by having obviously email or instant chatting, or just being able to have a texting alternative is always great. And the final one we're going to talk about are cognitive impairments. This is a new spectrum kind of when it comes to accessibility. It's been thought about a lot more with the recent years with the increased awareness of autism diagnosis in children. It's been no difference really in autism. It's just the fact that it's just being diagnosed more as we're learning more and more about it. So when we hear cognitive impairments, what does this actually mean? It could be my cousin Matthew who has Down syndrome. It could be the little boy I babysit with autism. It could be your friend who may have dyslexia. Or it could be me with extreme motion sickness. Now, this isn't something I can easily relate to others, but the extreme motion sickness is probably the most interesting to me because, well, it affects me. And it's kind of new to everybody else as people are becoming more aware of it. People are becoming more aware because the military has been bringing up these issues with flight simulators for years. We have these pilots that can do these crazy tricks in the air, but you put them behind a flight simulator and they get nauseous and they can't handle it. Now we're seeing that more and more with all of us being in front of a screen more often with too much parallax and too much movement, too many things going on. It's really not a fun situation for me. And has anyone ever been to Disney World? Have you ever been on that Star Wars motion simulator? I think it's at MGM or something like that. yeah, that's not really my ride, but it's you'd be sitting in these seats and they kind of move while you have this gigantic screen. Well, that's another example of you guys might be getting motion sickness just by doing that and you're not really actually moving. So what types of things should you be looking for when we are talking about cognitive impairments? You should ask yourself, are there too many colors, moving items, and images distracting the user, or not enabling them to comprehend the content easily? Are there a lot of gestures a user will need to memorize just to interact with your site? Is there a clear direction and layout to guide a user through the content? Or does the user have control over the video, or is that on autoplay? And does the font work for users who are sensitive to particular typefaces? And finally, is there too much movement as a user scrolls down the page? And relating this to you guys again, has anyone ever gotten confused with what kind of swipe gesture makes sense for a certain app that you might be using? I know I've been having this issue a lot lately with Snapchat's Snap Map feature, where it really takes me about 30 seconds to a minute every single time to remember, is it 2 fingers, is it 3 fingers, is it on this screen, or is it this screen? Do I zoom in or do I zoom out? And that is just super frustrating to me. I can't imagine someone who has that issue with longer term memory. And you may have asked why I brought up fonts and typefaces. Well, I have a fun fact for you guys about Comic Sans. If there's designers in here, and you guys all know about Comic Sans, please listen. I know it's an awful one. It's actually been proven that Comic Sans, as well as a couple other fonts that have been made for it, are great for reading or making reading easier for people with dyslexia. So we're actually seeing a lot of modules and stuff coming out, especially in WordPress, and Drupal has some as well, where you can just have a button in the top right corner where you can actually click and it will change all the fonts on that page to Comic Sans, or there's a couple other things like Open Dyslexia, and there's a couple others as well. And really, that should probably be the only time it's used, that in comic books, so just pay attention to who your demographic is and your audience that your website is for. So how is this currently being solved with cognitive impairments? Well, let's bring it back to elementary school. We want to make sure we keep it simple, stupid. Everything we do in our lives, we try to make it as simple as possible. So why not do this for our sites too? Unnecessary complexity should always be avoided. We want to make sure we keep everything as streamlined as possible, simple and consistent. We should be able to easily guide a user through our content on our pages. So people have laughed at me in the past. I'm sure if there are any designers in here, you might have gotten the same thing, but we had to take an entire class on color theory, which I know is kind of weird sometimes and people always question it. But for instances like this, it's really important to have that knowledge. We need to stay away from those awful color palettes that are super distracting or can cause eye strain. And I know you guys might have seen it. It's like when it's that magenta with that like weird blue and your eyes like don't know where to focus. That's even just simple knowledge like that, because there are some clients out there that will love that color combo. We also want to make sure that animations and media should always be controllable, and time limits for completing an action like a form should be generous or configurable. And finally, you want to make sure that too much movement will literally make me nauseous, so please stay away from excessive movement on the page, or like sit a couple seats away from me. So where are we today? Why are we talking about this? In reality, we can't really improve on anything unless we know where we are originally. And in reality, it's not awful, but it's also not great. Basically, we're doing all right. The topic seems to be coming up more and more with clients, but really, there is always room for improvements. Right now, accessibility is usually an afterthought when creating a site, or maybe a nice to have, but rather than making it a priority from the beginning. I know in the government, it's a little bit different with the 508, but just obviously as a whole, it's not always the first thing that you're thinking about. We want to make it more of a priority. The comparison I always like to bring up is the movement with responsive sites. It wasn't that long ago when we could put responsive sites as a line item. We could charge that extra amount for it. But if you think about it today, if that person doesn't have a responsive site, I'm probably not going to look at that because I'm probably looking at it on my phone. And accessibility is kind of that same way. It's more and more people are finding accessible products, but if your website isn't compatible, it's going to cause a lot of issues. And right now, Google actually penalizes you if you don't have a responsive site. They put you lower on the list. And although we're not there yet for accessibility, I can definitely see that happening in the near future. And we have to think about it. There are so many devices out there. Not only are there so many websites, both good and bad, there are also a lot of platforms to search the web. I know this is weird, but can you do me a favor and take out your phone for me and hold it up? Now, if you all look around, look at all the different things that we have going on. We have tablets, we have large iPhones, we have some Androids, we have, I don't have my glasses on, so I actually can't see any of the ones that are actually out there, but I see a tablet being held up. We got it all. He's holding up a computer. I don't know if it's on purpose or not, but, but it's there. And so if you think about it, we have so many phones, tablets, and computers. And like as we just saw, there's so many different iPhone sizes, various Android sizes, multiple iPads, Surfaces, 27-inch iMacs to small portable computers, and so on. It's overwhelming to think that what you create should work and work well on every platform, but we made that work. So now it's time for us to make it work for every type of user. So where can I start? Where can we all start? How do we get our businesses involved? How do we get everybody involved? So how can you really get it on board? And one thing I want everyone to always remember is that accessibility always takes a full team. In order to show significant results, accessibility must be incorporated into each existing link of the web production chain. The only way to successfully accomplish accessibility is to be able to plan it from the very beginning. And that means assigning responsibility to the various stakeholders and share the tasks in order to produce accessible content. So don't let it just be a line item in your proposal. Plan it for every junction of the project. We don't have responsive websites as a line item anymore, so why would we have accessibility as one too? Now, I know this can be a bit challenging at first. It usually takes up a lot of extra time. It takes up a lot of extra money. You're breaking some old habits. But really, it will become second nature over time. We want to avoid those issues like the scandal with Berkeley. We want to kind of always be ahead of that and make it easier for everyone to use, as I was trying to have you guys empathize with all the examples. So what is the best way to start planning out accessibility? And that's with project managers, of course. We'll start there. In an agile world where a PM is another member of the team with their own responsibilities, they would likely care very much about risk and how the development of a new feature will affect scope, time, and budget. So what types of things should project managers be doing to kind of help out with accessibility? So we were saying we want to make sure that we make accessibility a priority from the beginning. Incorporating checkpoints at each stage in the project ensures easy implementation and a great process. And probably the most important thing is we need to educate the client. Educating the client on correct HTML basics, just like heading structure or concise alt tags, will be extremely beneficial for the entire project. Now, I know this isn't a project manager's job, but providing resources for the client or being that resource to just point them in the right direction is really all that we need. And you may be asking why this is important. Why should we educate the client? And this is important because we work with content management systems like Drupal. The client is probably the content creator and in full control of the content, which brings me to my next team member, content creators. This is a tricky one, as I just mentioned. This could be a copywriter that the client hired, but it could also be the client themselves. This is why educating them is extremely important, whether it's for them to have the knowledge or to just give that information to their copywriter for something that works best for them. So what types of things do we want to work with content creators? Well, you'll hear this one a lot. We always want to include meaningful alternative text for all visuals on a page. It should be used to convey information that is equivalent to the meaning or purpose of the image, while also staying as succinct as possible. A good example I like to always bring up are logos. We all have them on our sites. So what type of things should we be writing when we have the alt text for a logo? Well, a lot of people will put in, I'll use @ Design Group as an example. It will say image of @ Design Group, or a logo of @ Design Group, or @ Design Group's logo, or anything of that sort. When in reality, it should just say @ Design Group. It's the same thing that we're conveying when we're looking at it. For more complex images, like charts and graphs, we want to make sure that we describe the image in the text of the page, or maybe in an image caption on why this image is significant and what it demonstrates. Now, I know charts and graphs are difficult. It's not saying that you have to do every single point, but maybe those important points that kind of break the trend, or is that important part that why you're looking at that chart. And what about decorative images? Well, designers, as you all probably have seen, like to include some images to carry more visual weight on a page, or just use to break up some content. But we want to remember that we still want to include alt text, but really we want to leave it blank, so it should still be on as an attribute on the image. The empty alt attribute cues screen readers to skip the image when reading the site. So a lot of times people won't even include that the alt attribute, but you always want to make sure you include it. We want to make sure that we always include headings to organize structure and content. Content on a page should be thought of like an outline. Ideally, the content should be created as an outline first, so that you kind of just see the basics of what it actually is. A lot of screen readers actually have the option to look at the page like an outline. There's a lot of Chrome extensions, for example, that you can click on and you can see what your content's actually going to look like. You can search by heading 1s, you can search by heading 2s, heading 3s, or even links. Having thorough yet concise headings will help your user read the information pertaining to them. And the biggest one is do not use paragraph tags and make it look like the way that you want it to look. Just because your H2 is too big for what you want it to look like on that page, we want to make sure we still use an H2 and then just style it the way that you are. It's not that much work to either use your WYSIWYG that hopefully the developer put on the page for you, or just go back to your designers to kind of create something else that will work well. Another good one is descriptive link text. We want to make sure we always avoid things like click here or learn more as links. Similar to headings, screen readers can search through all the links on the page. So you can imagine, I've seen it a lot on a bunch of home pages where it's just learn more, learn more, learn more, learn more. If you're looking at just those links, they're not going to know what the context is. Ideally, the purpose of each link should be determined by the link text alone. So let's say you're going to a page and you're learning HTML, and there's a link that kind of goes off the site. That link should say HTML, or it should say HTML basics or something of that sort, so they know. They already know it's a link. Now they just need to know what that is, and keeping it as succinct as possible is going to be ideal. And finally, we want to make sure that we always provide captions, transcripts, and descriptions for all media. All audio-enabled items should have some kind of fallback, whether it's closed captioning that follows along with the video, or transcripts like we mentioned before that we can look at instead of the visual. Next we'll come to a big one, designers. Design is a very important tool. It isn't just used to make something look pretty. It's used to make something organized, easy to understand, and accessible. So we want to make sure we always go for content first when possible. Design and development is used to leverage content, not the other way around. So the most organized and easy to use website will be one based on actual content. We want to make sure that we're always mindful of typography. It all starts with the right font size and typeface for your media, whether it's a billboard, it could be a piece of paper, it could be a laptop, it could be a small phone. Just make sure you choose the right font size and typeface for that, as they're kind of different in that sense. And it's also important to choose it based on your demographics. As we mentioned, Comic Sans is great for people with dyslexia and young children learning to read, so if you have a younger generation that's looking at it, I mean, you want to kind of work with something that is easy for them to understand. Creating a clear visual hierarchy with text is also important for quick gazing and quick understanding of the content overall. An important knowledge of line length and proportions keeps a user from straining their eyes on all the various devices that we're looking at your site. We want to make sure we provide good contrast for color blindness and low vision. Color blindness affects about 8% of the male population in the US. That's 1 in 12 men, or 1 in 12 users that might be coming in. As we all know, it's not really something women get affected by a lot, but I'll also tell you it's 1 in 200. That's still large. Oh, whoa, there it is. Contrast should always be strong enough for people with color blindness or low vision. Testing this with various colorblind simulators is a great way to overcome this. I'm going to have an example here. I use a Chrome extension called Spectrum, and I can look at the websites after the fact, and you can choose all the different various forms of color blindness to test your site. As you can see here, we have extremely bright, beautiful rainbow. But if we go to this next slide, we can see what it looks like as the most common form of color blindness, and this is the red-green deficiency. You can see how difficult it is to just, I don't even remember which one is red and which one's green. How difficult it is to see the difference between the red and the green. And just to show you, not all color blindness is the same. This is another one that has the lack of the yellows. So just showing an example, as you can see, it's very different from these two here. We also want to make sure we don't rely on color only to show distinctions. We want to use color as a way to highlight or complement what is actually already visible. It should not be the only visual means of conveying an information. An error should say that it's an error and not just be outlined in red. So you can see I took this from the Bootstrap default, and I went with the one with icons just to kind of prove my point, I guess. And as you can see, we have the default, we have a successful function or successful input, we have a warning, and we have an error. And if we go to this next slide, which shows it as the most common form of color blindness, if you don't have the text that says success, or that the username was already taken, or even the two icons, you might not be able to tell which error is actually there, and you won't know the difference between what's successful and what's an error. We want to make sure we create clear and intuitive layouts. An overcomplicated or inconsistent layout disrupts intuitive navigation and creates frustration. Going from one page to another and having the same actions look drastically different or placed in a very different spot will hinder the usability of your site. And as mentioned before, usable websites are more accessible. My favorite example is linkscar.com. If you guys are looking at this, it's pretty funny, it's super distracting, you don't know where to look, the color palette's terrible, there's a lot of movement, there's a lot of things going on. This is an example. Obviously we're not going to do this, I'd hope, but it still shows that these are out there. And the sad thing is that it's actually been updated and it's even worse, and I couldn't get myself to actually put it in.
Is that a real website?
It's a real one. I told you it's been updated, so it's worse than this now. The color palette's a little better, but it's... Yeah. Oh no, pay attention. Just kidding. It is a funny one though. There's a lot of ones that are actually out there. I mean, it catches your attention, so it's just awful. And finally, we want to make sure we critique, always critique. And this isn't just for designers, this is for everyone. We should always be getting feedback from other sources because we're all susceptible of mindful blindness. Ideas and technical aspects of great design will not improve without the input of an outside source. An outside source will help find errors and improvements that you may have overlooked because you've been looking at it for so long. If there's any developers in here, you obviously know that if you're looking and there's one error in that code and you can't find it, but it's really just a hidden comma or a period, it's going to drive you crazy, but someone else could come in and find it right away for you. So you could, as an outside source, you could have a potential user that fits your target audience or something like that, check over your design or your development. It could be another designer. Or there's a bunch of sites out there that will test for color contrast or font size, kind of what's best, tell you it's the pass-fail. And obviously, developers. And because this is kind of an overview of everything, all the team, I'm not going to go too in-depth on everything because I could probably talk about it for hours. But we'll talk about developers because it's what people tend to think about most when creating a website, an accessible website. So first we want to make sure we always use semantic markup for hierarchy and structure. This way screen readers can easily follow along the best it can. As mentioned before, using semantic markup creates a usable outline for the screen reader to easily navigate. So this is kind of small, sorry about that. So if you look at this, I've used some of the semantic markup here. We have navs, we have a header, we have a main, we have a footer. With the screen reader, you can easily skip down just to the main content. A lot of people tend to include the skip to main content section, but I have been told that they never use it if they're actually using a screen reader. They'll just skip over to main, and if they don't have that content on the page, they're probably going to go to a different website to find the same information. And kind of involved with the semantic markup is we want to make sure we pay attention to the markup on forms. This is like making sure a placeholder attribute is not being used in place of label tags. And we want to make sure, as this example will show, we want to kind of group related content together. So here you can see there's a field set, if you can actually read it. There's a field set that groups all the common elements together. And this one, as the legend says, are the title. So you can choose between Mr. or Miss. By the screen reader, it will know that that content's together and that you can choose between the two. There are a lot of times that designers may not want that label to be hidden or doesn't want it to be seen, but really you can hide that and still have it be read by a screen reader. What you want to do is you want to make sure you don't use display none. You want to use visibly hidden, that way the screen reader will still be able to read it. Next, we want to make sure we always capture the content creator's needs. All text, as I've said before, is very important and we keep bringing it up, but this should be included on every visual on your site. This can become a bit out of our control when working with a CMS. but making sure this attribute is required within the CMS reminds your content editor to fill it in, and then you won't have to worry about it being there. And if they're educated from the project manager, they'll have great alt text. This also goes for caption fields for large complex charts and images. It doesn't necessarily need to be required because it's obviously not needed for every single image, but it should be available to the content editor. And making sure the editor for each component includes all heading styles. That way we can stay away from those paragraphs that they make 20 pixels or bright red or whatever it is. We want to make sure we always enable keyboard navigation, another one that keeps coming up. This can greatly impact accessibility of your site for those who cannot use a mouse to navigate. And finally, this is one that I could go into forever, but I'll stay away from that for now. Aria Attributes, accessible rich internet applications. This has been a great addition to the web development community. This includes roles, properties, and states, for example. And one thing we want to remember is that Aria conveys semantic information about components, structures, and behaviors. Just because you give something a role doesn't make it function any differently. Just because you give an item a role of menu doesn't magically make it function like a menu. It needs to be within the semantic markup so the screen reader still knows kind of what's together and the user still knows what's together. A good example of Aria attributes are like fancy box or modal windows with a little X in the top right corner. We are looking at that and we can see that that's a close button. We know that's what it is. But if someone just uses text as an X or maybe a fun awesome icon or something of that sort or a background image, the screen reader is just going to go in there and see that it's just a button or that it's button X or it's an button image or something of that sort. But if you include the Aria label there, it will say that it's a closed button so they know to actually get out of that modal window. And the last leg are QA testers. Testing for accessibility is important at every single stage. It should be done by every link of the chain of operations. Designers should be checking other designers' work. Developers should be looking at the designers. You want to get the outside source from everybody and constantly be checking that with the various computers or like programs or just human quality. But that brings up to my next point. Like everything else, there should always be human quality to testing. A computer does a great job of getting the first round, but there will always be special cases. So we need to remember that computers are not humans. For instance, I've been testing with screen readers for a few years, but as I mentioned before, users like Derek, who's the kid from CU Boulder, uses it every day, and his experience is extremely different from mine. So yes, I can go through and I can see everything has the right attributes or anything, but is it easy for them to use? Does it still make sense? Is there a logical flow? This goes for colorblind as well. Before working at Atten, I worked in the country club industry for the first few years of my career. The target audience for the majority of websites I was designing and developing for were typical golf and country club members. Think retirement, Florida, elderly, and hard of seeing. Thank goodness my dad fit into that criteria of my usual target audience, and as mentioned, he's colorblind. So I found it extremely helpful that after using the programs to test for color blindness and contrast and quality, I would bring my fresh codeouts and designs to him, and I would have him check it out. And that way I could adjust as necessary for the human quality, just to get that little bit extra. So I want you to grab your team, and I want you to pour your heart into it and get excited about accessibility. Remember, anytime you are creating something more accessible for a certain demographic, means you're also creating a better experience for you as well as everyone else around you. So thank you, and I'll be up here with some questions. I have some resources here. I have so many resources, and I just couldn't fit it all on here, obviously, but I'll put the slides up on the page later on today so that you guys can have access to some of this as well.